When Theodore Roosevelt promised Americans a square deal, he meant something both simple and demanding, that everyone, the worker, the business owner, and the public alike, deserved a fair shake, and that prosperity carried a responsibility to the common good. It was a bet that fairness and enterprise could strengthen each other rather than stand in opposition. This panel tests that idea in America's 250th year, asking how large institutions can build trust, invest for the long term, support their communities, and share and serve the public good across questions of capital, technology, energy, and stewardship. Please welcome our panelists for the Square Deal at 250 discussion, moderated by one of our library trustees, Matthew Swift.
Thank you very much, Cortland, and what an honor it is to be here in Medora, North Dakota, at this remarkable place and this remarkable institution, not just honoring the life and legacy of President Roosevelt, but more than that, what a tremendous gift to the country. So my congratulations to Secretary Burgum, to Ed O'Keefe, the entire library team, especially on behalf of us trustees, how proud we are team here at the library and what this remarkable place is. So it's great to be with everyone today. I'm so excited for this conversation because when we think about history and what the turn of the century meant and also where we are today, I couldn't imagine a better panel than this. And so I'm so excited to be with all of you today. Doris, Kearns, Goodwin, of course, famed historian, thank you for opening everything this morning. Brian Moynihan, CEO of Bank of America. Brad Smith, President of Microsoft. And Charity Wallace of the State Department. Thank you all so very, very much for being here. We are talking about the Square Deal and what it meant at the time. And at this intersection of capitalism and opportunity and merit and morality, what this meant. And so I'd like to start by going back in history and asking you, Doris, to put things in perspective for us of what the Square Deal meant at the time and how it transformed not just the private sector, but its role within the United States.
Well, there's nothing I like more than talking about history, so I'm delighted to be able to do that. I wake up with history in the morning, think about history when I go to bed at night. So it is true, I think, that the turn of the 20th century is the time most reminiscent of our own. It's when Theodore Roosevelt was thrust into office by the assassination of McKinley, a really turbulent time because the Industrial Revolution had shaken up the economy, much like globalization and AI and tech have today. There was a massive gap between the rich and the poor. There were these colossal corporations that were swallowing up small companies. People in the West felt separated from people in the East. People in the countryside felt suspicious of those people, sinful people in the cities. New inventions were changing the pace of life. Workers were forming big unions, and there were nationwide strikes. And Roosevelt made a warning that democracy would be in peril if people in different sections and classes began, as they were doing, to regard each other as the other rather than as common American citizens. So that's where we were then, and here we are, and the political landscape filled with divisive rhetoric then. The Democrats wanted to break up the big corporations simply because they were big. They resorted to talking about them with hatred and fear and denouncing them. Socialists were gaining power each year, wanting government to take over the big corporations, the railroads, the mines, and the oil fields. Then you had right-wing conservatives who regarded the corporations as the golden goose that was producing the prosperity. Don't do anything with them. Leave them alone. So Roosevelt comes into this situation with a much more mature and sophisticated view that grew over time because he opened himself to the people around him. He did not go after corporations simply because they were big, only if they crushed competition. And if consolidation and efficiency brought corporations to lower prices and good wages for the labor, then he was fine with them. He commended them. But if they used their power to raise prices and decrease wages, then he went after them. He distinguished, he said, between good trusts and bad trusts. That's the moralistic part of TR. He loved talking in those terms. So what happens is, in his first term, he goes after two big corporations, railroad corporations formed by J.P. Morgan and meatpacking combination that was fixing prices. And it made him a very colorful figure to do so. He said he was the subject of cartoons all of a sudden as the dragon slayer of the corporations. It's very curious, he said. Ever since I've been in the presidency, I've been pictured consistently as a huge creature with enormous clenched teeth, a big spiked club, and a belt full of pistols, a roaring, swashbuckling type of ruffian. And yet all the time I'm growing in popularity. How could this be? And the newspaper guy said, because at heart, all the cartoonists really liked him. He had a good nature. But those lawsuits were not really his preferred choice. He felt they were too blunt, they were too slow, they might hurt the good trusts as well as the bad trusts. So what he really wanted was regulation from Congress to be able to understand what we were doing and move in a more rational fashion. But the problem was that the conservatives in Congress did not want regulation. So he decided, I have to do something about that. And what he did was decide to go to the people. That's where he was calling for. He's the steward of the people. He'll go out among them. He was out of the office more than any other president. He was on 6 long whistle-stop train tours across the country, 3 weeks here, 4 weeks there, 2 months there. And it was during one of those tours that he came up with the phrase, a square deal, for every man, capitalist and laborer, great or small, rich or poor, a slogan that would characterize his entire domestic program. He refused to attack the wealthy simply because they were wealthy, only if they used unfair means to accumulate their wealth. The rock of class hatred, he said, was the greatest and most dangerous rock in the course of any republic. Now, when he talked to people, he understood that many people might prefer the old conditions of life. They were nostalgic, when the average community was more self-dependent, when there was not these big cities, when there was less glaring inequality. But you can't go backward, he said. The Industrial Revolution has brought great progress. Our task now is to get the regulatory power to deal with the abuses. So he developed a bond with the people, a trust in his leadership. When he talked informally to these people in the West especially, he was always sure of reaching them with a simple language, he said, that his Harvard buddies would consider homely and rather commonplace. He spoke of decency, of fairness, of balancing different concerns. His sentences were always so balanced that a humorist made fun of him. He would say, here's what he says. On the one hand, the trusts are hideous monsters. On the other hand, the men who created them are enlightened engineers. If he said something good about Harvard, he would speak well of Yale in the next sentence. If he commended the color blue, he would speak positively of red. But most importantly, he had a temperament that knit the country together. A man from the East, he was also a man from the West, a rough rider who had trained in the South. He fit with people wherever he went. There was a story of an old man crying when he was listening to him, and they said, what's going on? He said, I fit with him. I fit with my president. So he developed a wellspring of support for his rational regulatory legislation. And with the people behind him, he had leverage over a reluctant Congress. They finally worked with him to create his Square Deal program, a rational program that softened the worst aspects of industrialism, protecting women and children from exploitation, enforcing rules for workers' compensation, ending discriminatory railroad rebates, opening corporate books to public inspection. He broke up monopolies that were not playing by the rules of the game, and of course became the guiding spirit behind conservation. So here we were with TR at the turn of the century, a square deal for the rich and the poor, the capitalist and the laborer. Hard to imagine a better banner for our politics today. Hard to imagine a better leader to guide us in this divisive time than Theodore Roosevelt. So let us bring him back to life in this great museum. With the AI, Teddy, I can't wait to talk to him. I've been waiting for this my whole life. I have so many questions to ask him.
And Doris, we're going to hear from the man responsible for AI, Teddy, in just a minute, and talk about the technology behind all of this. But Brian, I know, because I've seen you talk about this, and you, under your leadership at Bank of America, you have really supported so much investment into better understanding our history and our stories. Can you put into perspective, though, when the Square Deal and Teddy Roosevelt's legacy, talk about what that meant for the economy that we have today in America?
Well, in the end of the day, it's hard for people to fathom, but the United States was not a dominant place, in the 1850s, 60s, 70s. And so what happened out of that is you saw the formation of the combination of capitalism done the American style, which was to regulate but not stop and let people make money, let people be successful, let them recognize the opportunity, and democracy, which allowed one person, one vote, and there was on a meritocracy on that side, which goes back to the Founding Fathers' principles, frankly. It's not, it's not just democracy, it's democracy plus American capitalism. So after that, you saw the taking off of America's competency. We had great natural resources. Obviously, you can look out here and see the land, but for all types of activities, minerals and things like that. But what you really had was a spirit that said anybody could come from anywhere and be all they could be and be successful. So now you bring that forward and you think about our role in the world today, it's the same. America dominates the world's economies because it's the combination of people who you can be all you want to be in America, no matter who your father was, no matter who your mother was, no matter what country you come from, whether you're a male or a female, what ethnicity you are. You can be all you want to be, and that meritocracy is terrific. Now, the piece that we always have to be careful is to think about what falls out. If you're born with a physical, mental, and able to compete, if you have other things which make you not competent, we have to think about how we take care and make sure there's a balance in that. And that admonition from Teddy Roosevelt about the fairness of making sure labor, our teammates, as we call them, Bank of America, receive great rewards for their work, great prospects, a chance to have a career with us, a chance to take care of their families. That principle, that balance is critical, and that's something we can't forget about. We don't need it, jobs for life and things like that, which other economies have. But it's American-style capitalism done right, which started emerging then in a success, and then carries our country to be where it is today. And we have to continue that. We cannot let that. None of the other systems work like this one, and people have to remember that. Europe was as big as we were right before the financial crisis. They're now about 50% our size. Why? We licked our wounds, got up, and went forward. And life went on. And it wasn't pleasant. Being a banker in 2010 was not a pleasant place to be, believe me. But on the other hand, it worked. And that's what we got to be. So capitalism done right, capitalism done with a fairness and balance, thinking about the rewards that we have. And then, frankly, remembering that if people don't do it right, we got to take care of that. And that was his views about good trust and bad trust, or good corporations and bad corporations in today's parlance.
Well, and Brad, you think about the 3 C's, the corporate regulation, consumer protection, conservation of natural resources, and you think about the thing that I was so struck with when reading more about the Square Deal, and I look forward to learning so much more with your book. But you think about this was an era and a time when even basic health elements were not even a protection. The idea of consumer protection was a completely new concept. So please talk a little bit about, especially with your role today leading one of the largest technology companies in the world, what is the responsibility of the private sector to society and to government as a result, especially of the last over-century?
Yeah, I would offer 2 thoughts, and really to build on what Doris and Brian said. The first is, I think Theodore Roosevelt appreciated the virtues of the private sector, what enlightened, civically responsible leaders could do, not just to create jobs and build products, but genuinely help spread prosperity and be a force for good, as many of these leaders were, say, in the New York community, where a large majority of them lived. But then he had a second point of view, and Doris captured it as well. I think he fundamentally believed that businesses should not be left to their own devices. And he wanted to see people and companies and government itself governed by rules. And when he came in, he had limited tools with which to work. It was really railroads that had knitted the country together. The modern regulatory state was sort of born in the 1880s with the Interstate Commerce Commission. In the 1890s, the Sherman Antitrust Act was passed, named after the senator from Ohio, who was the brother of really probably the second most important Union general in the Civil War. Those were his tools. And when he looked around and he saw something like Standard Oil, these trusts that John D. Rockefeller had used to monopolize the oil market, not by gobbling up the oil wells, but by gobbling up all the contracts to move oil by train from the Midwest to the East, he felt that new rules were needed. And he was tough. He said, I'll use the Sherman Antitrust Act. It was and is only 2 paragraphs long. And he went to the courts and began to build it out. And ever since, we have had the perennial debate, is regulation too heavy? Is regulation too light? And there is always a pendulum moving back and forth, but in a sense it swings on a clock that he put in place.
But the key to that is where you started, was the private sector belief was going to,
Exactly.
done right, was going to fix it. And I think that gets lost in the debate 100 years hence.
And I do think, Doris, I really like the way that you referred to, it's hard to remember now. There was a school of thought that said, we don't want a private sector. There were some people who said there was no room for labor unions. There was another school that said there was no room for private companies. And if you want to put this in the context of the current day and the broader discussion and AI, and another voice now, Pope Leo XIV published an encyclical in 1891 that has now been widely emulated. And what he fundamentally did was the same thing that Teddy Roosevelt did. He said, look, I don't want to see Marxism spread. The private sector is an engine for prosperity, but workers need a voice. And it was Teddy Roosevelt who coined the phrase, the square deal, but it had been gaining momentum, not just in the United States, but in Europe as a concept to be advanced.
But I keep thinking about the fragility of the time. You talked about the fragility of our democracy this morning, and Brad's talking about the fragility even of the concept of our private sector.
And especially there was a fragility of the government. I mean, when Teddy Roosevelt got in, there was a huge coal strike between the unions that were being formed for the mine workers and the capitalist railroad carrying oil people, mine people. And he didn't have any power, he thought. You're not supposed to intervene. And the president, what's he supposed to do? It's not your business. He had to create a power that I'm the steward of the people. You are unions, you are the employers, but I'm representing the people. And that's what, if I could just follow up with something that Brad said, because we were talking about it in the green room when we mentioned Rockefeller. So finally, Roosevelt did go after Rockefeller for several reasons, but one of them had to do with these rebates that he got from the railroads, which gave him complete advantage over all the other refineries so that they couldn't get their things shipped. They were paying a much higher price. That's how his monopoly formed. So they finally went after him because these rebates were illegal. And this Judge Landis, who later became the commissioner of baseball, issued this huge, huge fine against him. Every single car that was carrying the oil was issued multi-millions of dollars at that time. So Mark Twain said of it, he said, well, we all knew it was going to be big, but like the woman who got married with her husband the first night, she didn't know it was going to be that big.
It's your turn. The rest.
God, just trying to get back on point. Okay. Charity, I'm so happy that you're on this panel. You and I have known you.
Why do I have to follow that?
Pivoting slightly. So Charity, you and I have known each other for such a long time, but throughout your entire career, you have been a public servant, and you are here. First, I want you to start by telling everyone, because actually we might be breaking a little news on this panel, which is your role at the State Department that you have just been appointed to, but also talk about your time in the public sector and the role that the public sector plays within our private sector as a result of the Square deal.
Sure. So it is sort of breaking. I just started a new position at the State Department as the U.S. Special Envoy for something called Best Future Generations. And it's working with First Ladies from around the world on Mrs. Trump launched Fostering the Future Together, which focuses on education and advanced technology. So Microsoft is one of our private sector partners that we're working with to advance American companies around the world, but also to advance education, working with governments. And I started in the public sector right out of college. I really wanted to work for Dr. Condoleezza Rice, and I saw her at an event as I graduated from college and said, I really want to work for you. And she said, go volunteer on President Bush's campaign. So I did, and I didn't know anyone, but I ended up with the Bushes for 16 years. So it was 8 years I was in the White House, and then at the State Department, and went down to Texas with them. But the reason I stayed in public service, frankly, is because I was at the White House on the day of September 11th and had to evacuate the White House. And I honestly wanted to leave and go back home to California. And then that evening I felt just a purpose and a calling that was greater than myself. So I stayed, and I didn't realize I was going to stay for so long. But when I think about even the banks, I was there during the G20, the very first G20, and it was in response to the financial crisis. So the idea of when does the government step in? And Dr. Rice talks about how being in public service is one of the greatest challenges, but also one of the greatest honors to be a part of it. And so when I think of the government, I'm more conservative. I think they should be sort of solely participating in solely what we're responsible for and uniquely capable of. So not being heavy-handed necessarily, but providing guardrails, if you will, to enable people to have human flourishing. And so I do think that the role of the public sector is to enable private sector, small businesses, people to have access to education and really flourish. And there's so many examples of even when I was, during my time in the Bush administration, President Bush, I think of the conservation that Teddy Roosevelt did. And President Bush was the very first president to actually preserve a huge part of the ocean. So there's an ocean reserve that we launched in 2006. It's 140,000 square miles of the ocean. And because he did that, 24 other countries followed. And so there's 2% of the ocean that is preserved because of his capability as a government leader to access that and to really create preservation beyond land, but in the ocean. So I just think of the public sector really to be there to enable and catalyze, be a catalyst for Americans to flourish and flourish all over the world.
So let's pivot for a second. We've got to talk, and I would like to. Absolutely. I'd like to go to you, Brad. I think an important parallel between this era and the era of Teddy Roosevelt was also there was a real lack of trust in today's institutions, not just public sector institutions, but in corporations as well. Talk about what it is like today running a company like Microsoft when there is this gap, this distance between the broader population and our leading companies and our government and our governmental institutions.
I do think we unfortunately live in a time when trust is definitely one of the things that's fragile. And we all have to really strive basically every day to earn the trust of the public, maybe our customers, it's the communities where we work more broadly. I think one of the biggest challenges when it comes to trust today, and this has obviously been well described, is that we no longer live in a country where people read the same thing. It's no longer a country where there's only 3 networks. And so you end up with people looking and having exposure to different facts. We also live in a country where, unfortunately, because of digital technology, especially social media and digital advertising, traditional newspapers have in many ways collapsed. And the number of counties in the country that no longer have a newspaper that's published with any frequency is a huge challenge. So what it means for a company like ours, just take an issue of the day, how does a local community feel about having a data center? How does it feel about having a data center come to town? How does it feel about the data center that may have been there for a long time? And interestingly, our first data center was built 20 years ago this year. It's a town in central Washington, Quincy, only about 7,000 people. But the poverty rate has been cut in half. The county has grown more rapidly even than the city of Seattle. The tax base is probably the strongest in the state of Washington in terms of local property taxes because there's a lot of value in the property of data centers. But even we find that in that area, there is one local newspaper that is published one day a month. So how do you reach people? And I think what we're having to do is go out and communicate in some old ways. Invited the whole town to a street party to celebrate our 20 years there, and some traditional ways, send a report through the mail. New ways, provide information on a Facebook group. I do think ultimately the key to trust is pretty much what it has always been. People should judge you by what you do, by your deeds, but if they don't know what you're doing, you've got to find a way to get out and have a real conversation and invest in new ways of communicating.
So Brian, how do you do that though with the intersection with technology? These days, a lot of times when you go to the bank, the hours have shrunk. The interaction, human-to-human interaction, is at an all-time low. And so, how do you navigate trust as such an enormous consumer brand?
Well, so we believe in high touch, high tech, so we have the capabilities however a customer wants it. But the simplest way to think about it is you have to be there to meet the needs of the customer. Some customers will need whatever, some customers will do it different ways, some customers have preference for it, but you have to meet that. And the way you navigate that is to listen. And so we have a convening thought in our company, what would you like the power to do? And if you're watching the World Cup, you've probably seen it more than you like. But the principle of that was about 15 years ago when we said we have to flip to be outside in everything we do. And so if you start with that principle, then you gain trust by actually listening. You don't gain trust by presuming an answer. You listen and then do what they do. And whether it's in one-on-one engagements, 3 million employee surveys, how people interact with you, all the different ways you can do it, you're building that trust. So it takes just a lot of work. And our risk then is how we run the company beyond that, right? So we have very low overdraft fees compared to anybody in the industry. Why? Because we thought that was a knockdown of trust. We shaped our mortgage business dramatically after the financial crisis because we believe that subprime mortgages are out there. We believe we can't do them or you hurt the brand. And so when you have a brand like ours, it actually does constrain some of the businesses. And then the third thing, it really goes to what Brad said. We come at basically the proposition pretty simple. We've got to do a great job for our clients, our teammates, our communities, our shareholders. You can't forget that community piece. We're only successful as our communities. And the oldest part of our company was formed in 1784. So the Treaty of Paris gets signed in 1783. 1784, we get a charter from a guy named Hancock, signed by a guy named Adams, who gives us our charter, and we start open a business. But you go back to the principle of that. It was to take money from people who had money and help them transact. And we'd thrown off England, but we caught the bus because we had no capital formation, no money. And then we lent it to people who needed it. And the charter says, at the time, the prospectus to raise the money says, to help small businesses be successful. It says it in old-fashioned English. And we just believe in that. So we have to get the trust by having the communities believe in what you're doing, even if they're not your clients, and then how you engage in a fairness with each client. And it's hard because it is a very easy statement for somebody to go out and say, big companies are bad. I'm sure that went on and with the newspapers and others editorializing and that. But on the other hand, if you build that kind of baseline, you can refute that, and that's where you end up with your scores along all those dimensions are all times high 15 years after people had a view of our industry and our company and our system as being not what they wanted.
But Brian, I'm struck by the opportunity to be on a panel with the two of you and talking about the Square deal, its legacy when it comes to governance and its intersection with the private sector. But the statistics today are showing so many elements that were seen in turn of the century, which inspired Teddy Roosevelt to create the Square deal. Affordability, income inequality, concentration among the big corporations, of which both of you lead. So what is it that you think we as Americans today should be thinking about doing and frankly wanting from our public sector officials in this next chapter of the American economy?
In the end of the day, American companies are large because they're successful. And as long as they aren't doing things that Teddy Roosevelt said, in other words, being a bad trust, how they use it to either not reward their employees sufficiently or overprice their customers. We're big because our economy is big. We're big because we're successful. We're big because of the most innovative and talented people working in these companies. So we have to be careful that that capability isn't used in the wrong way. But you can't damn it for its success, because at the end of the day, that's what makes this place extremely interesting. That's what created 80 million jobs from 1969 to 2019, when a bunch of technology came on stream that was going to destroy all jobs. When people were saying there'll be no managers in companies because computers will take them all out. That was Peter Drucker saying that in the 60s. Here you are. And it was just that innovative. So you got to be careful with that balance. And that, I think, between policymakers and courts, to some degree, is the hardest thing to do, because what could be represented to be, if somebody's overpaying in a conceptual, statistical, economic model, the reality is if you took that out, does it leave you in a place where you destroy an industry and it can't become successful? Because the market is 8 billion, not 300 million, that these companies, that our great companies are going against. And so that judgment is tough. When you find one that does it wrong, you have to hammer. And that sets up I was a lawyer by training, Brad, is to people, if you have accountability for mistakes and you have to pay it, people then will make sure they don't make them. And so you have to have that kind of accountability, and that's the idea of bringing the law down on people. So I think we have to be very careful. And I think Charity said it, you got to get that balance right. Brad said it, you got to get that swing right. And we have swung, but if we swing too far, you end up destroying what makes America, the success of America.
I would definitely, I'll say, end up where Brian ended up, but I'd offer a couple thoughts to perhaps help think about how one gets there. And I think these things are as true and valid for people, a family sitting around a kitchen table, as for broad policy debates or a big organization. The first is, I think oftentimes we find it hard to come to a common solution because we don't have a shared understanding of the problem. So much of politics is this solution versus that solution. And I think the more time one can take to have a conversation about the problem, to put data into it, to get different perspectives and enlighten us all, then you start to build some basis for consensus. The second is, one of the conclusions I came to when Microsoft was literally under a court order to be broken up in the year 2000 in the Clinton administration, was there's a great, to me, a metaphor for life. Every time you look at yourself in a mirror, you usually go, I look good today. And then most times when you see a photograph of yourself, you go, that's not a very good photograph. I don't look that good in that photo. I want to find another one. We look at ourselves the way we do in a mirror. Other people look at ourselves the way they do in a photograph. And so I think if you really want to build a common understanding, you've got to be able to step outside yourself and at least see yourself through other people's eyes. And then you get to these debates, because I do fundamentally believe that it's about a level of balance. And you can look at our country and you can look around and say it's fragile, but I think when you put it in a broad historical perspective, what really stands out is its resilience. Mm-hmm. But I think the key to resilience is always trying to build more of a common understanding so that the pendulum doesn't go so far to one end or the other. You don't kill the very thing that is the fundamental engine for prosperity and the creation of jobs and the like. But it does require, I think, a level of discourse, which I think a place like this can help advance.
So Charity, let's talk a little bit about the work that the First Lady wants to do on technology and how we, thinking about that intersection of AI and morality to a point. Talk a little bit about what you're bringing to the table as a solution.
Okay. And I also want to double click on the distrust. I think, to your point, there were 3 local stations that every American used to watch. Now there's 2,500 or more. And so people can get their news and their perspectives, which from very distinct points of view, and it aligns typically with how they feel. And so it creates this idea that there are there's the other versus it's just another person with a different perspective. And so I think the algorithms that we have created this division that may not actually exist as much when you do have conversation with people. So I do think the idea of having, to your point, discourse and conversation is really important. And to building trust, I think about the government. We need to do what we say we're going to do, and if we don't, we need to explain why we didn't. And so I think that's how you build trust and transparency. And so I think, watching the cabinet meetings on television has been fascinating to me, but it's very interesting for Americans to be able to have a bird's eye view into what happens at the federal government level. Like, what are these cabinet secretaries saying? What are they doing? You have some sort of insight into the government that hasn't been there before. So I did want to just double click on the distrust because I do think it's a huge issue. And one of the things that I've loved about the World Cup is having all these foreigners come to the United States and say, I was told this about America and Americans, and none of it is true. they're amazing, they're generous, they're hospitable, and all their food is incredible. All these different places that they've visited in the country. And for me, it's just a reminder that everything we're told may not always be true through our algorithm. And so that's why I think it's really important for us to have that diversity of how we get information. But with regards to your question, so the First Lady is focused on education for children. And one of the aspects of it is this idea of leveraging AI so that there's digital skills and technology that children all over the world can access to have greater opportunity in education. We know that education is the way in which you can continue to build your wealth and your prosperity and success. And so it's something that she's very focused on. But one of the challenges is safety online. And that's one of the debates that we're having. It's the idea of what are the regulations that we need to put in place so that there's a privacy aspect of it, but also we don't put it in place so much that, that there's interesting debates around regulation as it relates to AI, what children will have access to. So that's one of the main areas of focus, is really thinking about what is safety, because there's so much exploitation, sadly, online of kids. And so that's one of the biggest responsibilities I think that we have. As we're heading into a new frontier in technology, which is new to, we love AI, we use AI, but it's, there are unknowns. And so it's the idea of what are the types of regulations that we need to put in place so that kids are safe online, and all of us are, frankly.
The accountability for the outcome of technology applied in a business is clear. We can't say, oh, the machine made me do it. You turn down a loan, you do this, whatever. The odd thing is these technologies have other things as we just discussed, that there is no regulation around it. It's going to be interesting because there's speed limits. They may be different. They may differ at different times, but there's speed limits. And so these basic things that, you can't regulate, because I think society is saying, no, we got to figure out some way that I don't have to worry about what my child is going to be exposed to, because they can open up a computer for all those wonderful things it can do for him or her. And so it's going to be an interesting time, but there's a push, as always, to go to the places you think you can get after fast, our companies. And you're saying, we're already accountable. We give you the wrong answer, it's our problem. I don't care how we got to the answer. And so they're forgetting that the places that are actually, I think society is focused is different.
Yeah, I think I've seen two really interesting lessons in 2026 relating to AI and call it a square deal and the role of law and the like. The first, Brian, was really the kind of thing that you're describing. Most companies, especially those that deal a lot with consumers, are very focused on retaining the trust, because otherwise they're going to lose them. And so I was very struck recently. There was a project that we worked on with one of our customers that was using AI to evaluate claims for reimbursement under insurance. But the interesting thing about it was they empowered the AI so it could say, yes, you are going to be reimbursed, but only a human could say no. And I think that's a very logical way to think about how to divide and use AI as a tool. And what the interesting thing about it was, then when it went to the human, it had, here's all the information and here's the rules. And so the person who was doing the work actually was applying much more judgment and spending much less time just trying to find things. So I hope that is one model. But then I think the other example of what we're living through as an industry, and you're reading about every day in this summer, is we sort of went from looking at the EU and said, boy, that EU AI Act is too heavy. And so we did embark on what I might almost call laissez-faire AI. And then we discovered that with AI frontier models being so capable of enabling someone to, say, launch a cyber attack, engage in a ransomware attack on a hospital or a school, that I think the White House, the Trump administration, quite rightly concluded, wait a second, we have to intervene. But interestingly, right now, we have regulation without rules. And now we are going back to, I'll say, a Roosevelt lesson. Look, you need to have the right rules. You want them to be transparent. It's impossible for businesses to plan if there's if you don't have rules that have been published. You actually want the kind of conversation to create rules that are a little bit, I would say, detached from the crisis of the moment so that people can be more thoughtful. And I think once again, we're going to find that one of the technologies that again reshapes the economy, redefines in some ways a lot of the ways people interact, is going to need to be subject to, call it a new version of a square deal.
If I could just add one thing to when you talked about social media and the lack of 3 television networks and people not even believing the same things in different parts of the country. I mean, it's even deeper than that today, which studies show that people live in the same communities now more likely with people who agree with them, so that they see people in silos in other parts of the country. And here, Theodore Roosevelt has something to say to us about this, because he argued, and it was during his last years of his life, he talked a lot about the need for some sort of service program. He wanted a mandatory military program, but he really wanted to have some real service program where people could, I think, if I could do one thing right now, to have a national service program where the kid from the city goes to the country, the kid from the heartland goes to the coasts, and they have to spend a common couple years maybe. I would even, whether it's mandatory or voluntary, we have voluntary ones, they're not making enough of an impact. Where you get people to live in another part of the country with the people they thought were other than them, and they're working on something where they're making a difference together in a mission, whether it's disaster relief or teaching people to read, and then they go back to vocational school or college, whatever, with that sense that we're Americans, we're together in this thing. I mean, military service does that, but we don't want that to have to be the only way to do it. And Roosevelt was thinking about that. I've just been learning more about that. I want to find everything he's ever said about that, because I think that would be wonderful.
Well, and I do want to, absolutely. I do want to end in just a moment. I want to end talking a little bit about, just as a reflection of the fact that we are at the 250th birthday. But before we do that, Doris, when you look at all the parallels that we've talked about between this era and the era of Teddy Roosevelt, one just very stark difference, the speed of change that is taking place. How would he have handled the just sheer speed of change that we're seeing today?
Well, it's interesting. People always ask me of my 4 guys, which one would be best in the modern era of the tweet, and it would definitely be Roosevelt. I mean, he was able to speak at a very moment and say something that was pithy, speak softly and carry a big stick, or don't hit until you have to and then hit harder. He had, I'm not even sure I knew what half of those things meant, but they sounded so great. And I could see him come. I mean, Lincoln never wanted to speak extemporaneously. He would hate to have to communicate in this speed. He prepared everything he wrote. When people would come and give him a serenade when the Union had won a battle and they wanted a speech, and he'd come out on the balcony, he'd say, no speech now. Let's just sing to the army, and we'll congratulate the soldiers. And he prepared everything he did. I think Roosevelt would have been able, he had that quick mind. I can see him on social media. I think he'd be great on tweets.
Well, go to the AI and have the AI do it. You can
Yeah,
have,
well, I'm going to ask, we talk, I'm going to meet AI
Exactly.
very soon. This is so
have the
exciting.
AI do social media. You can.
So
That's a good idea. I'll say, what would you say today? When he has 16, whatever it is.
So as we close things out and we get ready for July 4th, I'd like for each of you to just share one key lesson from the legacy of Theodore Roosevelt and what you would like Americans to really think about. There was a recent Gallup poll that came out that talked about the level of pride people have in being an American, and the difference between Democrats and Republicans was incredibly stark, but also the generational difference was enormous in terms of the pride that people feel about being an American. But as we enter into this important few days for the country, what this institution means for the country, but also the broader reflection we need to take. What is one lesson from TR that you would say you want Americans to really listen to? Let's start with you, Charity.
That's a hard one. I mean, he has so much for us to learn from. I love the lines, the think boldly, care deeply, live passionately. Those are the things I think. And when I'm reading The Square Deal, he talks a lot about the integrity of individuals and the idea of having leaders who are educated, but their bodies are strong and minds are strong, and they have integrity. And I think that's critical. I'm so proud to be an American, and I hope that even as, like I said, the World Cup, people from all over the world see how fabulous America is in so many ways. And so I think it's going back to the lessons of where we came from and where we're going, the progress that we've been able to make, and the fact that anyone can become a president of the United States, you know, from wherever background you came from. And I think that's such a unique aspect of America.
Brad.
Well, I think Teddy Roosevelt embodied in his life something that actually Alexis de Tocqueville had identified when he came to the United States in 1831. Because he would go from town to town. A lot of this he first saw in Massachusetts. And he said where in France they would look to the king to solve a problem. And in England they'd look to a lord. In America, he said, people associate. What he was really talking about is what in many ways we call nonprofits. If people wanted to build a museum, start a church, raise money for a hospital, they would just come together and take it on. And we should always remember, as a company that works around the world, there is no other country that matches what this country has. There are 1.8 million nonprofit organizations. 10% of the American workforce is employed in nonprofits. And look at this place. Yes, it was a governor, but he didn't just go to the legislature or to Washington, D.C. He turned to companies. He turned to people he knew. He built a community. Many of you in this room, you embody that, and it is a fundamental strength now and into the future.
I just saw the readings by the various famous people, including Doris, but the arena idea. I always say, blessed be the sports writers because they never play the game. But, you know, the reality is you know, he was curious, he was thoughtful, he traveled the world, he learned about a lot of stuff, but he said you have to do stuff. And that, get down in the field and play, get in there and behave at times of stress and everything, I think is the lesson we have to learn, because we can sit there and talk at each other, maybe more to Terry's point, you know, for hours and hours, but somebody at the point, you have to do it. And I think he was a master at saying, okay, let's do something. Yeah.
And I think that what the lesson that Theodore Roosevelt has for us is not just what he did, but who he was. The most important thing, I think, in any leadership position is character. And I think that's what he had. And what are the qualities of character? Humility and empathy and resilience and accountability and taking responsibility and having ambition for something larger than self. And I think he would want more people to understand, as you're growing up your kids in your own families, as they're being taught in schools, as they're going into public life, that morality underneath character is the critical thing we need in this country. We've had it for many, many years. We still have it every now. We still have it now, but we've got to foster it even more. It's the moral underpinning to the democracy.
And I think I'll answer my own question as well, which is I loved his absolute love of sitting with people he disagreed with and learning from them, and I think that is something we need to see a lot more of. Doris, Brian, Brad, Charity, thank you for putting this into perspective for all of us here today, and thank you for your support of this remarkable institution here in Medora, and grateful for your perspectives. Thank you.